Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have a great guest for you tonight. It's Roar Mikalsen. His name is spelled Roar, R-O-A-R, but I'm not going to even attempt the Norwegian pronunciation. Roar Mikalsen is in Norway. He recently conducted a civil disobedience action in Oslo. We'll be showing a brief video from that. Have that video shortly. But first, as we always do, we will bring on our infamous dancing cannabis leaves.
I feel the force.
Okay, welcome to our Hemp News segment of our program. First story tonight are about initiatives in South Dakota and Missouri. Activists behind proposed citizens' initiatives to legalize marijuana in Missouri and in South Dakota have provided officials with the requisite number of signatures to qualify their campaigns for this November ballot. In Missouri, the group Legal Missouri 2022 turned in more than 385,000 signatures on Sunday. That's more than double the total 171,592 signatures necessary to place the proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot. In South Dakota, representatives with the group South Dakotans for Better Marijuana Laws also recently submitted over 19,000 signatures from voters. Advocates needed 16,961 signatures from registered South Dakota voters in order to qualify the initiative for the ballot. State officials must now conduct an official assessment of the signature petitions and verify their authenticity before determining whether the two measures will appear on November's ballot. Missouri's proposed measure would allow adults to possess up to 3 ounces, purchase from licensed retailers, and home cultivate up to 6 flowering plants, limited quantities of cannabis. It would also establish a program to automatically review and expunge those with criminal records for nonviolent marijuana-related offenses. Dan Vietz, the advisory board chairman for Legal Missouri 2022 and a longtime NORML advocate, said, quote, "It's time to stop treating adults who use marijuana like criminals. It's also time to repair the damage that marijuana prohibition has done to hundreds and thousands of Missourians' lives by expunging their criminal records," end quote. South Dakota's proposal permits adults to possess up to 1 ounce, home cultivate up to 3 mature plants, and or transfer without remuneration limited quantities of cannabis. The measure does not seek to establish a regulatory framework governing the licensed production and retail sale of marijuana. In November 2020, the majority of South Dakota voters decided in favor of a separate citizen initiative measure, Constitutional Amendment A, legalizing the adult use, possession, and the licensed retail sale of cannabis. However, shortly following the vote, Republican Governor Kristi Noem facilitated litigation seeking to strike down the law as unconstitutional. Justices on the South Dakota Supreme Court eventually ruled 4-1 that the amendment violated the single subject requirement of the South Dakota Constitution. A House-approved bill seeking to legalize the adult use of marijuana in South Dakota was defeated in the Senate by the Republican Party in February. Matthew Schweitz, the campaign director of South Dakota's marijuana initiative, said, quote, "We're very proud to submit these petitions, and we're extremely thankful to the voters who added their signatures to the volunteers who helped us finish the petition drive. This campaign was a statewide grassroots effort that involved thousands of South Dakotans," end quote. Maryland voters in November will also decide on a proposed constitutional amendment that asks voters, quote, "Do you favor the legalization of adult use cannabis in the state of Maryland?" end quote. Additional information on these campaigns is available online from Legal Missouri 2022 and from South Dakotans for Better Marijuana Laws. Voters in the city of Austin, Texas, has overwhelmingly approved the local ballot measure, Proposition A, depenalizing marijuana possession and prohibiting police from executing no-knock warrants. The language of the measure stipulates that Austin police officers, quote, "shall not issue citations or make arrests for Class A or Class B misdemeanor possession of marijuana offenses End quote. Absent defendants' alleged involvement in felony-level narcotics cases, police will still be permitted to confiscate cannabis from those who possess it in small quantities. Austin voters passed the proposition by a margin of 85% to 15%. Texas does not allow for statewide citizen-initiated measures. The success of this local initiative affirms that the majority of Texas voters are solidly in favor of relaxing marijuana penalties. It's high time that state lawmakers recognize this reality and represented their constituents accordingly by taking legislative action to reform Texas's archaic and overly punitive marijuana laws. The overwhelming margin that this effort passed by is indicative of the broad support that exists among voters in Texas. While those local announcements are important, they result in a patchwork of differing marijuana enforcement policies based on location. It's time for lawmakers in 2023 to take steps to enact Texas reform. Statewide polling finds that 67% of Texans, including a majority of Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, support legalizing the sale and use of marijuana. Texas police made an estimated 219,000 marijuana-related arrests between 2017 and 2021. 97% of those arrested were charged only with possession of small amounts of marijuana. Legal marijuana states generate more revenue from retail cannabis sales than they did from alcohol sales, according to data provided by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. According to the ITEP's analysis, legal states in 2021 collected an estimated 20% more taxes from retail marijuana sales than from the sale of alcohol products. In California, cannabis excise taxes brought in more than double the revenue of alcohol-related taxes. In Colorado, cannabis tax revenues totaled 7 times those of alcohol. It's remarkable that in the span of just a few years, the narrow sin tax that states created to apply to cannabis purchases have managed to surpass the comparable taxes that have long applied to alcohol. According to a separate analysis provided earlier this year by the Marijuana Policy Project, tax revenues derived from the licensed retail sale of state legal adult use cannabis grew by more than 30% between 2020 and 2021, totaling over $3.7 billion last year. Next story is out of Ontario, Canada. The use of cannabis products is associated with perceived improvements in insomnia in patients suffering from either anxiety or depression, according to data published in the journal, the British Medical Journal Psychiatry. A team of Canadian researchers assessed the effectiveness of cannabis in managing insomnia in a cohort of 677 subjects. Study participants suffered from either anxiety, depression, or from both conditions simultaneously. The subjects self-administered cannabis products at home and reported symptom changes in real time on a mobile software application. The investigators analyzed reports from over 8,400 cannabis use sessions recorded over a 3-year period. Participants perceived CBD-dominant products to be less effective than others with THC. The authors concluded, quote, "The naturalistic investigation of cannabis use for insomnia suggests that individuals with depression, anxiety, and comorbid depression and anxiety perceive benefits from using cannabis for sleep. In addition, compared to other cannabis strains, CBD-dominant products may be less helpful for sleep, specifically in individuals with depression. The current study highlights the need for placebo-controlled investigating the efficacy and safety of cannabinoids for sleep in individuals with mood and anxiety disorders," end quote. This study, an investigation of cannabis use for insomnia in depression and anxiety in a naturalistic sample, appears in this month's edition of the British Medical Journal's Psychiatry. Our last story tonight is out of New York City. The adoption of nationwide regulations governing the retail sale of cannabis to adults is not associated with sustained increases in young people's cannabis consumption, according to data published in the journal Addiction. An international team of researchers from Chile, the United States, and Uruguay assessed cannabis use trends in Uruguay among those ages 12 to 21, following legalization in Uruguay initially approved legislation legalizing the use of cannabis by adults in 2013, although retail sales in licensed pharmacies did not begin until 2017. Under the law, cannabis sales are restricted to those age 18 or older who register with the state. Commercially available cannabis products may only be produced by state licensed entities and sold at specially licensed pharmacies. THC levels are capped by regulators and government price controls are imposed on the flower. Limited home cultivation is allowed in private households. Consistent with prior studies, the researchers reported no significant changes in cannabis use patterns among either adolescents or young adults. Among those under the age of 18, marijuana use fell following legalization. Among those ages 18 to 21, cannabis use initially rose, but then decreased. The authors concluded, quote, the legalization of recreational cannabis in Uruguay was not associated with overall increases in either past year or past month cannabis use, or with multi-year changes in any risky and frequent cannabis use among young people, end quote. Numerous North American studies have similarly failed to identify any significant upticks in cannabis use by young people following the adoption of adult use legalization in either U.S. states or in Canada. This study, does recreational cannabis legalization change cannabis use patterns? Evidence from secondary school students in Uruguay appears in this month's edition of Addiction. And that is the end of our hemp news segment tonight. Now we have a great interview with Roar Mikalsen. He is an activist in Oslo, Norway. This is his third time to come on our show. He's going to talk about his recent civil disobedience action in front of the police headquarters in Oslo, where he set up and offered cannabis for sale, and they smoked some there in front of the police as well. So also, if you are a loved one, are looking for help qualifying or getting a medical recommendation to use medical marijuana, give us a call. We have referral service. Just call us at 503-235-4606. Again, if you need help with medical marijuana or with any other marijuana-related issue, you can call our office at 503-235-4606. Here's Roar Mikalsen in Oslo, Norway, and keep working to restore hemp.
Hello, I would like to welcome back to Cannabis Common Sense Roar Mikalsen in Norway. It's Oslo, Norway, right?
This is Oslo, Norway. Yes.
And that's the national capital. And you're the head of the Alliance for Rights-Oriented Drug Policy. So, and you've recently, back on September 11th of 2001, which is now about 7 or 8 months ago, you did a civil disobedience action in front of the police station there in Norway. I think we have a videotape of that, and now would probably be a real good time to roll it. So let's go ahead and roll that videotape, and we'll be right back.
Legger opp til avkriminalisering, så dette aktiverer akkurat, skal automatisk aktivere tiltalen salg da, og 2 års strafferamme og så videre.
Du har intensjon om å dele ut dette som på bordet?
Jeg regner jo med at politiet etter hvert vil stanse dette her sånn. De har vært klar over hele veien om hva jeg vil gjøre underveis, og nå er vi på det stadiet hvor politiet må avgjøre om de vil stanse dette, eller ta med seg noen kjøpere i problemstillingen også.
Da venter vi spent på politiets reaksjon.
Så i mellomtiden så ligger det 7 jointer her sånn, som de har ikke tenkt å betale for en eneste igjen, men hvis man vil ha med seg noen kjøpere inn i leddet her sånn, det er mulig politiet vil det, siden de bare står her enda og venter på oss.
Ja.
Du har fått noen klar beskjed om hva du vil gjøre?
Nei, jeg venter egentlig på å bli arrestert, ja da.
Ja, kan ikke gjøre det.
Ja, ikke sant?
Det er gøy.
Jeg tenker kanskje de vil gripe inn i det en av dere kommer for å...
Ja, skal jeg gå først?
Det må du gjerne gjøre hvis du vil bli historisk.
Ja. Hva heter du?
Og der kommer politiet. Der kommer politiet.
Nå har vi snakket om her. Så går det her over. Det kan ikke være greit lenger. Så kan vi beklage det som er.
Unnskyld, hvor tjenestenummeret ditt?
Hæ?
Hvor tjenestenummeret ditt?
Vi har det her.
Ja. Ikke det meningen at det skal være synlig når du utfører en tjenestehandling?
Når du spør etter det, så får du det.
Ja, takk.
P068.
Takk. Og andre tjenestene er W508. Innsatsleder her.
This civil disobedience campaign was the result of many years of our Alliance for Rights-oriented drug policies trying to influence the political process in Norway, but getting nowhere. And we have always been keen to deliver this responsibility for human rights to politicians. And there was this drug reform commission that declared that moral panic had been the key to the evolution of drug policy in Norway and elsewhere.
When did that come out?
That was in 2019 that this report of the Norwegian Royal Commission on Drug Policy Reform.
Okay.
So they found that moral panic had been the key to the evolution of drug policy. And we have argued to the politicians that there is a link between moral panic and human rights violations. And that we are dealing with the same problem, the same arbitrary persecution as previous laws that we have left behind in history, like the homosexual laws and racial segregation laws, these kinds of laws.
Mhm.
And so we have had this claim for many years to the politicians, and we have confronted the Minister of Health and the Minister of Justice and every other politician with this issue and their obligation to ensure that the rights of the persecuted are being looked at properly and secured. And we have gotten nowhere with the political process. So this is why we announced to the politicians and the police that we will have this civil disobedience campaign on September 11th. And the clip you saw was from this civil disobedience campaign. And after that, it's been a year almost now where we have been in touch with the police and preparing the courts. And first, the police would give us 1 day to present our evidence in court for these human rights violations. And we complained to the courts and say that we need 3 days to present evidence of the link between moral panic and human rights violations. And the court agreed, and they gave us 3 days to present the human rights argument so we could look at this properly. And we would present evidence. We presented also a list of evidence, including witnesses, which were the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Health, the Director of Public Prosecutions, important people in the chain of responsibility for drug policy and the punishment. So we have a list of witnesses that we want to include in court, and we have 4 movies documentary movies that we also want to use to show this link between moral panic and human rights violations.
Let me ask you a question. In terms of those witnesses you're calling, are they all of the same opinion? Were they on that royal commission that has to do with the panic and drug policy?
There are different. You have the former Minister of Health that disagrees now that he has changed his perspective. He have changed perspective, and Bent Høie, the former Minister of Health, who has been the Minister of Health for 10 years almost, which has had he had a lot to do with this drug policy reform. And he was a prohibitionist until 2016, and after that he has changed his opinion. And now he wants to decriminalize drugs, and he says that also that punishment needs to be explained, that it can be a reason that can explain punishment. And as of yet, the state has no good reasons to explain punishment in the field of drug policy. So there's while the current Minister of Health disagrees with the former and says that we need the prohibition to succeed with us, with society. The former minister disagrees, and we also have the state. We also have the director of public prosecutions that agrees with this position and believes that principles of equality, proportionality, and autonomy and liberty presumption must weigh heavily if liberal rule of law is to be remained in Norway. So this is the reasons why he put himself behind the drug policy reform, which has not gone through because of prohibitionist politicians that do not want to lose control, you know.
Yeah. So, Roar, I remember I was first drawn to your work because of several books you've written on human rights and constitutional liberties and drug policy. Do you want to name the various books? You wouldn't have to have a copy nearby, would you?
I don't have a copy at the moment where I'm sitting, but there is.
We have photos of their covers, so we can go through them.
There is human rising that is been used as an arguable claim in the court of law as an explanation for why there is a link between modern day drug policies and former arbitrary persecutions, campaigns of arbitrary persecution, and the scapegoating phenomenon and how this runs through drug policy and these former campaigns. So there's this human rising that we have been using as an arguable claim in courts for the last 10 years in Norway. And this is also the to right or wrong, which is more about the American system of law and how the founder system of law was I measured the founder system of principled law in opposition to the modern day system of arbitrary law, and checked this evolution of how this founder system was undermined by the modern day court system, and how I also show in a case study there how 100 cases of constitutional complaints in America has been mishandled by the American court system, according to this principled reasoning that is at the bottom of the U.S. Constitution.
Let me just talk about that for just a minute, because I was mentioning you before the show, and you probably recall, I had myself filed 2 constitutional challenges to our Oregon drug laws. And so in terms of the history, the real definition of the right to privacy started in America with the birth control Griswold case out of Connecticut back in the 1950s. That was the first court ruling that established a right to privacy or any other right in the unenumerated rights that are detailed in our 9th and 10th Amendments. And so then Paul Krasner, who was the guitarist, songwriter, and sometimes singer for the Jefferson Airplane and later the Jefferson Starship, was arrested in Hawaii, and he mounted a constitutional case. And out of the Hawaii Supreme Court 3 members, one of the members wrote a dissenting opinion saying that Canner did have a constitutional right to possess marijuana. Later, in Michigan's Supreme Court in 1972, there was a case of John Sinclair, and he had been in prison for a couple of years, and he mounted a constitutional challenge to the case. And there was a big, after he'd been in prison for 2 years, the singer-songwriter of the Beatles, John Lennon, and Yoko Ono, and Stevie Wonder, and Bob Seger, and Phil Oakes, and several other people had a benefit concert for him. That was a big deal there. And 3 nights later, the Michigan Supreme Court overturned the Michigan marijuana laws, and marijuana became legal in Michigan for about 25 days until the legislature declared an emergency and came with new, less draconian penalties. But then that was the second big, privacy case for cannabis liberation. The third one was really in Alaska I'm sure you're aware of Raven versus the state of Alaska, where Raven, a school teacher, had been growing cannabis and he claimed it was his right. And the Alaskan Supreme Court had a declared right to privacy in their constitution. And they held that made marijuana legal. And it was for about 15 years until the Republican Party mounted a petition campaign and overturned that Raven versing. But now, of course, marijuana is completely legal here based on initiative politics. Tell us about the government system in Norway. Norway is part of the European Union?
Norway is not part of the
It's not
European
part of the
Union, but we are connected in some part through treaties, but we are in the outskirts of the European Union, and
Okay.
we are not under it.
How does how are human rights enumerated in Norway? You've got a constitutional monarchy. Is that similar to Great Britain with a parliament?
We are similar to most European countries and Canada in that we have a constitution and we have courts, tribunals that are supposed to look at to protect human rights for its citizens. If the national system of human rights do not properly give the fair trial to people who challenge the constitution, then you have the European Court of Human Rights where we can complain. And the European Court of Human Rights is in Strasbourg. So it has never really looked at this issue of drug prohibition and if there is a right to drug use and if this right to drug use includes a regulated market. This is the way we are asking this question now. And sooner or later, this if the national courts will not look at it, we will go to the European Court of Human Rights, and they will have to decide.
So your case is coming up in June. Is it June 1st?
This is June 1st. Yes.
And so you had the arrest. Tell us what happened after that arrest and how it's been going in preparation for your case.
After that arrest, I was brought over to the police car where you can see on the movie, and I was interrogated for maybe 30 minutes and allowed to return to the demonstration and talk to people who have attended. The police have been very polite in this civil disobedience campaign, very professional. As long as there has been a camera, they will try to make their best appearance.
And you notified them in advance and had press releases to announce this civil disobedience.
Yes, we were given 2 hours to do this demonstration. So, but we were surprised that they did not arrest us sooner than they actually did. They let us fire up joints before they entered the premises. So we were very happy with the police's contribution in the beginning of the case. And as the case evolved, they refused to. You can see on this movie that we have a cannabis plant there. They refused to bring this cannabis plant into the court negotiations because we say that this plant can become many kilos of cannabis. So this is why we are touching up on the strictest part of the Norwegian drug law, and that we want to give effect to the rights of also the most persecuted part of the drug using population in those who face 21-year sentences. So we brought
just mentioning that here's a picture of myself and our TV show producer with 2 plants that each produced over 7 kilos of cannabis, of flowers, and about 7 kilos of shake as well. They're both about 5 meters or about 15 feet tall and 15 feet wide. They're grown outdoors here in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah. And if it's more than a kilo of cannabis, you're looking at maybe a 2-year sentence as a baseline, traditionally speaking. So, and the police would not bring this plant into the equation because, they would have to. I have a former case where I was caught with like 25 plants, and they decided that this would surmount to like 100 kilos, and we were taken in court for a 100-kilo sentence.
Were those indoor
plants?
Those were indoor plants.
Indoor plants don't produce nearly as much.
No, but we were building a bigger system indoors which had not been finished. So they were arguing that when the system has been finished and built, it would produce 100 kilos a year or something. That was this was in 2005, the first time I entered the courts, arguing that the prohibition was a crime against humanity and a violation of human rights.
And how did that turn out?
That turned out into a 8.5 years sentence, which
You were incarcerated for 8.5 years.
This was also a storehouse I had where there were found cannabis products. So these two cases were taken together.
Yeah.
And
you were locked up for 8.5 years.
I was locked up for 6.5 years. So then they released me for probation.
I see.
I've been out for 4 years now. No,
what
6
was
years
that
now.
like? I mean,
6 years
was it calm? I'm not sure about the prison system in Norway. Is it? You want to talk about that at all?
The prison system in Norway and its quality.
Yeah. For your experience there.
I experienced the closed prison system for 4 years. It was much better than the amateur system, which is more punitive. Still, there's a lot of isolation, and if you do not really have a purpose there, I've considered myself a political prisoner. So I was flying through these years easily because I had a purpose, and I did not see myself through the eyes of society. But most other prisoners see themselves through the eyes of society, and they feel shame, and they feel the distance that is to the outside. And I believe that the more we as a society stop using prisons, the better we are served for the evolution of society. Because if you have these long sentences, it's very difficult to get back to a normal life. And the American system is really terrible. And the drug war has been very terrible for the American civil population. Millions and I think it's like between 40 and 50 millions now that has been incarcerated because of the drug war in America.
There are more people currently being incarcerated. There's a case in Florida where a gentleman just got sentenced to a minimum of 8 to 15 years in federal prison for solely a marijuana crime. And I at one point faced a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence, but I was found not guilty here in Portland back in '93. But I did do a 5.5-month sentence in Oregon prison for violating probation, for being on probation for growing marijuana. I went to school in China, and I did get the proper permission, other things. But now you've recently been told by the court that you're not going to be allowed to present the witnesses in your defense. I know you, back on April 9th, filed a request to maintain the list of evidence and present it to the court. And then on the 20th, great day, April 20th, you filed a complaint against the police attorney for fighting against the presentation of this evidence.
Yes.
And so
this is the case. We were very happy with the police in the beginning of the case, but as the case evolves, we see that they will not include this plant, and they will not include the human rights argument. The police say that
obviously have a economic motivation for their own job safety, or so they think.
There has been a scandal unfolding in Norway with the Norwegian drug police. They have an association that has become the focus of media attention because of this has been functioning as a lobbyist organization for the prohibition in towards politicians and to maintain the prohibition regime during the drug reform in Norway. And they have a lot of power.
We similarly had the police constantly using their offices and time against federal law and state law that says non-elected public officials can't get involved in political process. But time and time again,
including back in 1986 when Ronald Reagan was president. Ed Meese, the Attorney General, ruled that our initiative to legalize marijuana in Oregon, which is on the ballot in November of '86, was not a political issue. It was a law enforcement issue, and therefore we had the attorney generals from about 15 different states coming to our state, and the vice president of the United States, who would soon to be president, George H.W. Bush. He toured our state for 13 days. That time, he was the first head of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or what we in America call the drug czar. And I don't know how we got a czar, but we did. And anyway, he came across and spent 13 days in our little state building up opposition to that. But that's another story again. So they recently ruled
angle, whether this is the whether this is the domain of politicians or the courts. It's been an argument, and it's also an argument in Norway. Whether the police say that this is the domain of the politicians and not the prosecutor or the courts, they will say. So, but basically the problem is that moral panic has been detected by the Royal Commission, and this being detective officials, public officials also have a responsibility to protect human rights. And the evidence we have presented unequivocally really shows the connection between moral panic and human rights violations, because this is a logical connection. To the extent that there has been a moral panic, principles of equality, proportionality, the liberty presumption will not have been maintained, and there is a need to look at and balance the law out in accordance with these principles to protect the individual and society at the best level, and not with the most terrible law, but with better tailored laws for this area.
So just last week, a few days ago, they ruled that you cannot present your evidence, or was it the court that's trying your case?
Yes, first the police complained about our list of evidence because they obviously do not want these ministers of justice to be presented as witnesses and explain themselves. We have had articles in the Norwegian papers throwing questions at these politicians, and they refuse to answer. And other politicians have asked them questions that they cannot answer because there is this blind spot that they need to maintain to continue the status quo. And the police do not want us to have witnesses that can present evidence of human rights violations. So they were desperate to stop these witnesses, and they have managed to do so by stopping our list of evidence. Now, at the present time, we cannot present any witnesses, nor any documentation, nor any movie documentaries that shows the link between moral panic and human rights violations. We are prohibited from doing, but we are taking this. We are complaining about this, and we are hopeful that the court will overturn this ruling. But there has been a ruling.
So this trial, can you present the video of what happened there that day? How long is that video?
The video that you showed us?
Yeah.
This is you show them the best part of the video, the arrest. This is there are some other videos also, but we have not really, I believe maybe 30 minutes of footage or something in total.
Can you show that? Who is the arbiter? Will you be able to have a jury of other Norwegian Oslo citizens, or is the court going to be, the judge be the arbiter, the decider?
There will be a judge and 2 jurors on this.
2?
Yeah.
And do they both have to agree that you're guilty?
Probably they will. They say that in this verdict that came out, that they refuse us to present evidence, that they still want to look at the human rights situation and evaluate if it's against the the human rights conventions to punish me for this civil disobedience campaign. They say that they will look at this from the previous court decisions and not make new laws, they say. And the Norwegian Supreme Court a month ago had three important cases that looked at the rights for drug users. But they measured, it was a travesty of law from the from the Norwegian Supreme Court, because in their human rights analysis, they weight the rights image of drug users according to the signals that had come from the politicians, and so they used the politicians' reasoning to evaluate if there were human rights involved, and to the extent rights were evaluated. They did not look at it from a principled perspective and begin with basics. They just accepted the premises that have always driven prohibition. So this is a complaint that we also have against the Norwegian human rights, the Norwegian Supreme Court system that made this terrible judgment.
What about in the parliamentary system? I know in Germany, the Greens and the new coalition governments in favor of cannabis legalization. We've seen that happen, I guess, in Malta and Luxembourg, I think now. And so,
and Belgium and Germany.
And then here in the United States, of course, we have ever widening area where marijuana is legalized. And then the World Health Organization, they're in Austria, in Vienna, they ruled that marijuana was off of the list of completely prohibited medical products. You know, it had been ruled that it didn't have any medical use and had to be prohibited. But just in the past year, the United Nations ruled that it does have medical properties. And I know the United States and European Union were in favor of those changes. They were opposed in Russia and China. They opposed those the marijuana liberalization. But the European Union did. I don't know exactly what Norway's position was in there. Isn't Sweden a little even more prohibitionist than Norway? Sweden has a very tough regime, doesn't it?
If possible, Sweden is even worse than Norway. But I see the reform community is growing in Sweden, so there is a debate that is coming in Sweden also. But it has been the most Stalinist country in Europe.
In parliament that back legalization in Norway?
Excuse me, what did you say?
Are there any members of parliament or parties in the parliament of Norway that back legalization?
There is the Left Party and the Environmental Party that backs the regulation of cannabis. But the major political parties do not want to discuss the legalization or regulation alternative. They want to maintain the prohibition and then look at what they can do with the drug policy.
So recently we had the worldwide new cannabis holiday of April 20th. And there's also just this last weekend on Saturday, May 7th, a series of marches throughout the world. I know very large ones in South America. I think they had 200,000 people marching in Buenos Aires and 150,000 in Medellin, Colombia. In New York City, the oldest marijuana parade, for the second year in a row, they had the Majority Leader of the United States Senate, Chuck Schumer, speaking. And this year, it was raining. Last year was nice and sunny. I got to speak there back about 2015, but the old editor of High Times magazine held the umbrella above Chuck Schumer, the Majority Leader of the Senate, as he gave his second plug for legalization. So theoretically, the United States House has already passed legalization. Yeah. Now, if they can just somehow get it through the United States Senate, we could see it federally. And that will have an impact, I'm sure, there.
It's
Were there
very
any marches there in Norway around this May 7th event?
if there are any.
Were there any marches that were part of the global marijuana march that took place on May 7th? Were there any of that happening there in Oslo?
I think in Bergen, a smaller town, there were some marches, but in Oslo, I believe no organization made it happen.
Mhm, mhm. Can you appeal the ruling that you can't present this evidence? Is that just the way it's going to be on June 1st at your trial? Or will you be able to say, hold it, I want to ask the higher court? Or does it go directly to the Supreme Court? Or is there a in-between court like the U.S. Court of Appeals?
We are complaining about this district court opinion that say we are not allowed to present evidence. This week we are looking at presenting this complaint, and the court also, in its refusal to let us present evidence, took away two days of court for us. So now we are left with 1 day in court. So we are complaining about this, and we have good reasons to complain. We have a handful of Norwegian professors of law that say that we have a clear right to a fair trial here, and that the right is being transgressed upon with this denial of evidence. So in either case,
we would call it an appeal.
And we also have an interesting because in the first time I was in the justice system in 2010, there were a similar case where the first court did not want to let us present evidence or complaint to the next court about the violation of human rights crimes, and we complained about this in 2010, and the second court looked at this issue separately and gave an opinion that say that the human rights issue also has to be tried in its fullness, and so they changed the opinion of the district court in that case. So the relevance here is clear, and the court has admitted 10 years ago that the human rights argument needs to be presented in its fullness, and now that moral panic has been detected, we have an even better argument for the courts to look at this issue. So we are hopeful that they will change their decision.
And so that needs to happen before the trial on June 1st, or is there any chance that that trial could be postponed?
We will wait and see. Unless the Norwegian system handles this matter properly, we will have another civil disobedience campaign late summer or fall. We will see, but a similar campaign where we again get the system going, a court process going for this issue, because the Norwegian justice system needs to evolve its jurisprudence on this topic.
The very first marijuana protest I went to, which was just a week after my 18th birthday, was the White House smoke-in in Washington, D.C. And so it was a series of events organized by the Yippies primarily, and they were mainly civil disobedience protests. And Jimmy Carter was president then, and people would line up saying, bust us. We chanted, bust us, but there were 5,000 of us, and there was no way they could bust 5,000 of us. A few people got busted on the fringes, but there were like 10 police on horses, and then 10 police on motorcycles, and then 10 on horses, 10 on motorcycles. One of the things we did back then, Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer. That was his occupation. Outside of being a naval officer on a nuclear submarine for 20 years, he also was raised and operated, after he got out of the Navy, a peanut farm. So we had marijuana seeds, and at that point, the U.S. government was paying to spray poison on marijuana plants in Mexico, poison called paraquat. And that paraquat would get harvested, come back to the United States, and people would smoke it, and they would die because it would poison their lungs and destroy their lungs. So one of our chants was paraquat peanuts, and we threw all of our marijuana seeds on the White House lawn, and they had to fight the sprouting there. But that was my very first action in terms of a marijuana legalization campaign. Things were a little bit more radical back here in the United States in the 1970s, that's for sure. When you have 5,000 people to back you up. And that was the day before the big 4th of July smoke in. This was the bust-in day, which
Yeah.
the 3rd of July. So it
There
was.
there were a lot of activism going in the 70s in America, and then the 80s slowed it down, and the drug war came back.
Came and declared the war on drugs. That turned back the clock. We all thought marijuana is going to be legal in the 80s, but once the Reagan Bush Republican minority took over the government, it's been downhill ever since in terms of their participation in drug policy reform. But
it is perplexing that the Republicans have a strong anti-marijuana policy, because they are constitutionally very strong on other issues and want to protect the American Constitution, and still they are this blind spot is so big.
They were lied to and said this is a deadly drug. It causes moral degradation, and that's why they implemented the campaign, the war on drugs, was to disenfranchise leftists and African Americans, and it was pretty successful. Nixon admitted that in the White House, as did his henchman Bob Haldeman, but that came out pretty heavily about 5 years ago. So June 1st is coming up, and give us like a best case, a likely case, and a worst case scenario in terms of what would be the best case out of what happens from this stage forward.
The best case would be that we are allowed to present our evidence of a connection between moral panic and human rights violations, and that we get 3 days in court to present this evidence, and that the judge agrees with us or reasoning and finds that the prohibition laws that are incompatible with the human rights provisions. If this happens, the court system will give some kind of judgment that the politics has to change, and so they have to frame the political process according to constitutional terms, so to speak, because now the political process has never been evaluated according to constitutional limits. It has just been assumed that this problem needs to be fought by totalitarian means. But whether less totalitarian means are more proper to deal with the problem of drug use, then this is what we are trying to look at. And if this is the best scenario, that this court system...
able to raise the international law angle, given the change in the UN treaties on drug control and the World Health Organization? Are you able to raise that these restrictions that many courts give the same weight as the Constitution now have been removed?
The Norwegian court system is becoming more aligned with the international community. So, and this is an international trend, that this is why the human rights system is evolving as it does. American system has its own human rights system, but it's basically the same principles that build this system of justice.
So that's the best scenario. What's the most likely scenario in terms of what do you think's going to happen?
The most likely scenario is that the judge will say that this is the area for politicians to deal with, and that he will refer to the Supreme Court decision that was recently made, which does not explain anything, whether there's a good idea to treat alcohol users or cannabis users differently. The system has never looked at this issue. And then we will take it to the European Court of Human Rights, which we are more hopeful will give a proper ruling in this area. So maybe in 1 year or 2 years, we will have a proper ruling from the European Court of Human Rights, which can be affected on all European countries. So this would be better maybe for the evolution of law in Europe if it goes bad in Norway. So it's difficult to say what is the best scenario here, but in either case, it's a big step forward because we present a lot of questions that the judge will have great difficulty in not looking at and not answering. And to the extent that he fails to answer this question, we will have a way forward in the justice system.
What about, God forbid, a worst case scenario? Are you looking at serious jail time? What's the worst case in this? What if the judge decides, he hates marijuana and thinks you're doing evil things and he thinks you should be punished? What will happen?
I believe the worst scenario, so to speak, would be maybe I have no idea, maybe a month in prison or something. I have not really considered this option because it's peanuts anyway, and to the extent that it will go this direction, we will still have a good moral position. So we build our terrain from this moral position anyway. So we just see what happens.
So you're gonna can carry out another civil disobedience action. Do you have anything you can announce in terms of a timeline or what might be coming up there?
Probably something around September because we need some time to present this. We need to see what happens in court, and then we will see if we will maybe start doing some articles in the Norwegian papers about this. And so we need a couple of months to prepare this civil disobedience campaign anyway. So it will be realistic to look at September for this opportunity.
If our viewers are interested in getting your books and taking a look at your books, where's the best place to go look for those?
My books are found at lifelibertybooks.com, and a website which is dedicated to these books that I have written. And
So that's
lifelibertybooks.com.
Okay.
No, it's .com, yes. lifelibertybooks.com. And arodpolicies.org is the organization that promotes this human rights defense in court, which I'm the leader of.
So AROD.org or policy?
Yeah, policies as in politics,
So AROD policies.
Yeah, you can write it under the.
We will.
Yeah.
Bill will do that. Something else for him. Thank you, Bill. And thank you, Roar. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing to our audience out here?
I love discussing the civil disobedience with you because you have a long history of this yourself and a great knowledge of the American system of law. So it's been a great experience talking with you again, Paul.
Well, it's been good having you on. This is your third time on. I look forward to having you back on in the near future to tell us how things are developing there in Norway. And thanks for coming on again, and keep up your work to restore him.
Thank you for looking after us here in Norway. Good luck out there.
Try it.